Hi again. William Schnell has been discussing the changes in the 1930s, specifically wrapped around the development of a class system, a very clear class system, based on types from the Old Testament. Now he's talking about incorporating the Gibeonites. Let us note in a bit more detail how they cleverly made use of the scriptural picture of the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites, as you will remember, were the inhabitants of a Canaanite city lying in the pathway of Israel's occupation of the Promised Land. Long before Joshua and the Israelites approached the environs of the city, these good people sent a deputation to Joshua, pledging subjection and asking in exchange a pledge of protection. The Gibeonites made it appear as if they had come from a far distant country. It was not until after a treaty of peace had been duly made and ratified that it was discovered that the Gibeonites had tricked Joshua. Israel reluctantly honored the treaty and allowed the Gibeonites to dwell in their midst and to share their blessings. It even fought a battle for them against the Canaanites. But Israel did not integrate the Gibeonites into itself. Instead, it made of them slaves, or hewers of wood and carriers of water, as the scriptural account puts it. The Gibeonites gladly accepted this role in exchange for the benefits which it afforded. It is this event which the Watchtower Society culled out of the history of Israel in order to justify and interpret the role which it planned for the Jonadabs, or unspiritual great multitude, now great crowd, within its midst. This story adapted itself admirably to the Society's purpose, even though anyone not already in the Watchtower clutches and hypnotized by the Watchtower jargon will have a hard time to see the connection. Anyway, in this explanation, the Society did not ostensibly lower its sights. Did it not have scriptural precedence and warrant for its action? It lifted the sights even higher to its Watchtower plateau, which was actually the highway to Zion of Isaiah 35. So a way was designed for the multitude of newcomers to live within the new nation. It no longer mattered that they were not spirit-begotten. They could dwell within the framework of God's organization as slaves, as modern hewers of wood and waters, and rather carriers of water, so to speak. What a vista for increase was opened up here for the Watchtower by virtue of this explanation. The Watchtower Society correctly saw that this new class was present by the millions throughout the land of the antitypical Canaanites, namely Christendom. And so the book, Preparation, 1933, shows in discussing the prophecy of Zechariah, this would not only be limited to Christendom. This class would be drawn from all the nations of the world, whether Christian or pagan, there being 10 men who grasp the coat of him who is the Jew. That's a verse from the end of Zechariah chapter 8. By this it meant that other nations, not of Christendom, also contained millions of such people of goodwill, which latter term was intended to indicate a fine shade of differentiation. So subtly here, the Watchtower Society was laying the groundwork, first for the emergence of a vast unspiritual class, and therefore an unchristian class, out of the lands of Christendom, and then later for the emergence of a still larger class, to come from out of the pagan nations, a class which never so much as laid claim to the spirituality of Christianity. Thus, naturally, would the Jonadabs become the great multitude. His subhead now is Christianity Discarded. The Watchtower Society had reached a point where it was forced to go even further. Quietly and imperceptibly, it now had to disrobe itself of the mantle of Christianity, which it had so long worn for a cover and disguise. This was necessary if it were to be at all successful among the discontented masses within Christendom, and later of Christ-hating heathendom. So the Watchtower Society set about to bring a change in its designation or name. The only name under heaven by which men can be saved had become an impediment to the progress of the New World Society. It no longer suited its policy of world rule, nor fitted its worldwide proselyting purposes. A general and more universal designation had to be found. Looking back into their blueprint of the formation of Israel of old, in the Old Testament, they soon hit upon the idea of calling themselves after the name of Jehovah, Jehovah's Witnesses. In thus seeking to shed all connection with Christ, they failed to realize that they were also publicly branding themselves as opposers of him who had provided for Christ's first appearance on earth for man's redemption. And what was equally condemning in our age, at this late stage of events, they set themselves as an organization squarely athwart the path of Christ's second coming. They displayed the characteristics of the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel, standing in the place it ought not to stand. And as the apostle warns concerning the Antichrist, so the New World Society pitted itself against the returning of Christ, that is, the visible returning of Christ. This Watchtower doctrine thus became a confusing and heady wine that would make drunken all the nations of the world, instead of bringing in a condition of soberness advocated by Paul as being so necessary as the end approaches. This was now 1931, and was to mark another milestone in theocracy's advance. 12 years of the second tier of the Watchtower Society, as I term the new setup, had elapsed since 1919. Since this was a historical fact within the ken of all Jehovah's Witnesses who read their books, the Society grasped this occasion to nail down its newly adopted doctrines and practices. It did this by issuing a 3-volume commemorative publication entitled Vindication, 1932. Even though the Society had by this time disowned the name of Christ, it did not think it inconsistent to make use of one of Christ's parables to further its purpose. In fact, it saw a real advantage in doing so. This would help cover up the fact that it had, for the sake of expediency, turned its back on Christianity by choosing a name other than the only name by which men can be saved. At the same time, it could give Christian color to its argument. It found a parable which was admirably adapted for its misuse, namely the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. It compared the 12 years since 1919 to the 12 hours of the parable. All the laborers in the organization were to receive an equal reward, regardless of the length or type of service. And what reward was that to be? Why, the wonderful new name, Jehovah's Witnesses. This parable served their purpose wonderfully well. The organization even had the counterpart of the murmurers of the parable. They were the older ones, or rather the ones who had worked the longer. These were those of the Mordecai Naomi class, which had, with some of the new Ruth Esther class, turned aside in disappointment and dissatisfaction. But all, without exception and without distinction, even those newly come in as unspiritual Jonadabs, would now have one designation. The spiritual and unspiritual alike would be comprehended under the one name, Jehovah's Witnesses. Herewith, the parable had served its purpose. This gave all, regardless of class, the same standing within the organization. It made it a synagogue or assembly, alike in breadth to the kingdoms and nations of the world. In appropriating this interpretation of the parable, the Society presumed itself to be a theocracy, thereby claiming to be the spiritual Israel, or the new nation. In so doing, it turned its back on the ecclesia, or Church of Christ, which is selective and not at all comprehensive in its structure, as was the Jewish synagogue. Thus the Watchtower Society and its Jehovah's Witnesses ceased to be Christian in essence as well as in name. But in order to bring forth the intended multitudes from out of Christendom, and later from heathendom, the organization had to make a name for itself. The best way to accomplish this purpose was to go to war. It is surprising how well and how long the scriptural story of the Gibeonites served the Watchtower purpose. The Society now, as had Israel of old, went to war in behalf of its adopted Gibeonites, the Jonadabs. It carried the battle for freedom of worship all the way from the justice of the peace to the Supreme Court. Throughout the battle, the Society feigned the role of martyr and underdog and emerged as a victorious hero. The campaign was 100% successful. The details of this battle will be told in subsequent pages. Yes, the Watchtower organization had stooped and had conquered. Next chapter, the strategy pays off, chapter 12. Put in a link to how the Watchtower still finds its modern history in Zechariah 14. Remember, Jehovah's feet standing on the Mount of Olives. What does the Watchtower do with all of this? I'll put in the first of 6 videos we did on this chapter, where the Watchtower reinterprets that marvelous passage from Zechariah 14. The first is on your screen, and also the Zechariah playlist, where we have a lot more from this book the Watchtower has abused much over the decades. See you next time.